Thank you.
My guest today is Professor Harold Cole, who's Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. He has authored or co-authored 9 books, published more than 200 articles, testified regularly before Congress, and litigated numerous cases involving international law issues in both US and international tribunals. Welcome, Harold.
Hello. Hi, Gill. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with, I think you have a book coming out. So the 21st Century National Security Constitution. Is the book out already?
Yes, June 25th. You can buy it
Okay.
on Amazon. Yeah.
Is the title the same, the 21st Century National Security Constitution?
No, the National Security Constitution in the 21st century. I can explain how that came about.
Okay,
What,
go ahead.
as a scholar, I've been teaching at Yale Law School since 1985. And my dean, Guido Calabresi, asked me once, what's your idea? And he said, it's always good to have 2 ideas if you can. And I have 2 ideas. One is the National Security Constitution and transnational legal process. Both of them are procedural approaches to law, public law. One has to do with constitutional law in the United States, the National Security Constitution. The other has to do with how the international law works to restrain governmental overreaching. So both of these are rule of law principles. So the National Security Constitution grew out of the work I did as a postgraduate. I was a law clerk to judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals, and then Justice Harry Blackmun at the Supreme Court. Then I worked at the Justice Department in the Reagan administration. And when I got to Yale in 1985 as a teacher, I started teaching a course about foreign affairs and the Constitution. And then the Iran-Contra affair happened, which many of your listeners may not even have heard of. But it was an example of what my concern was, which is that the branches of government in the U.S. government are supposed to be in checks and balances, but in fact, this balance has become unbalanced because of executive overreaching, congressional acquiescence, and judicial deference. And I started to realize that people always saw these crises or scandals as problems of individuals as opposed to problems of structure. So I decided to write a book an article in 1988, it's a long time ago, called Why the President Almost Always Wins in Foreign Affairs. And Yale Press asked me to write it as a book, which I did to get tenure in 1990. But when I finished that book, which was 34 years ago, I thought I really should rewrite this someday for the 21st century. And since then, I've been in 4 presidential administrations, and I've learned a lot. And so I decided in 2021, after I left the Biden administration, that I would revamp the book for hopefully the next 75 years. And it couldn't be more topical now because of the Supreme Court's recent decision on immunity and other things. And so it traces this pattern from the beginning of the American Republic now to the present day, Joe Biden, and then beyond Biden or Trump, whoever will be the next president.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about, so you say here, even as the Biden administration's foreign policy unfolds, in 21st century practice, foreign relations law seems to have largely become national security law. Virtually all foreign affairs issues have been reframed into national security terms. And you can, without any background in law, I mean, you can sort of see that in the news stream, right? It is all foreign affairs. It's about national security. And in some sense, it's sort of interesting. I grew up in India, as I mentioned, and when I came here, there were a lot of sort of foreign country issues that the US was getting involved in, but it was never really framed as a national security issue. Is it 9/11 that sort of changed the whole thing?
I would argue that it's the international environment into a state of constant threat. So, it started with this all in the book. It starts with the beginning of the Republic when the US was a very small country that could be exterminated. It rose to become a regional power and then a hegemon in the world after World War II. And then the Cold War set in. And as I trace in the book, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period to what I'd call the post-Cold War period after the fall of the Berlin Wall to the age of terrorism in 9/11. And then most recently in the age of individualized threats from, cyber commands, from pandemics, from climate change. Everything now implicates national security. And what I've been arguing is this is a reservoir of power for the president, because increasingly only the president seems to have the capacity to respond to these threats. Congress is less and less willing to do anything, and the courts are less and less willing to set limits on the president's power.
So you say here, as you mentioned, the synergistic dysfunction among our national security institutions that has fostered these trends explains why the major academic debates over foreign relations law have missed this most urgent issue and suggest ways to slow the steady march toward executive unilateralism. So what do you mean by executive unilateralism?
It means that, if you ask an American school child, what is the basic principle of our Constitution? They say checks and balances and separation of powers. That means no branch acts alone, and the president is not a king. Increasingly, the president acts unilaterally and is a king. And now, as we see from last week's Supreme Court decision, he's immune if he uses his official tool. So this is going so dramatically against the original spirit of the Constitution. It's a constitutional transformation without formal amendment. And I think the point that I really want to make is people tend to be focused on personalities. Is the problem Trump or Biden or Modi or Macron or whoever? But this problem is structural. I say that some presidents overreach proactively, like George W. Bush and Trump, and some presidents who want to be more restrained, like Biden and Obama, end up having so little legislative support that they reach out reactively. And so whatever happens, this trend toward unilateralism is the pendulum keeps swinging in that direction further and further. And Trump, I think, took it to a new level. This is obviously a dramatic current interest, because the whole idea was the president was supposed to protect us from national security threats. That's why he needs so much power. Well, what do you do if the president himself becomes a national security threat? Then giving him so much freedom actually makes him less and less accountable, and that's the danger.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court seems to agree with that idea. If I understand this correctly, the recent decision is that the president, if it's an official action, even if it's criminal, that's okay. Is that the way to internalize the Supreme Court decision?
That's pretty close, Gill, and not bad. They say essentially that there are three zones: the president's exclusive power, where his immunity is absolute; other areas where he has a presumption of immunity as long as he's using official tools; and then they say that he's exempt from having evidence introduced of his engaging in official act. But it's important to see how much of a change this is from American history. The president, virtually everything he does, he uses official tools. So, for example, during Watergate, which you and I remember, but maybe not everybody, Nixon talked to his attorney general about how to engage in various kinds of theft of the election.
Hmm.
And they now say that because it's official communication between the president and the attorney general, this is not subject to examination from the outside. If this were the law in 1974, Nixon could have done this without any fear. Or to take the example of the Iran-Contra affair, there Reagan authorized essentially a group of private individuals to conduct a covert foreign policy. And to do that would essentially mean he's divesting himself of official action, but he's not subject to any kind of review at all. Now, the challenge will now be, for example, the current case involving Stormy Daniels, where Trump was convicted for 34 counts. You would think that paying money from your private account to pay off someone who is a porn star so she doesn't sell her story to a tabloid is purely private. But arguably, if he sits in his office and uses official pens and telephones, they could argue that no evidence of that could be introduced. We have to see how broadly this test is actually applied. But at this moment, it's terrifyingly broad.
So this executive unilateralism you talk about. So in parliamentary democracies, let's say UK and India, for instance, I always felt that the president brings a level of efficiency. The presidency, I should say, brings a level of efficiency into the decision-making process. And parliamentary democracies sometimes have a tendency to get caught in noise that you cannot get anything done in any way. So is there a trade-off there, efficiency versus decisions that is unilateral?
Yes, it's a trade-off, and that trade-off was made in 1789 by the Constitution. We had a king, and saying king governed England and India. Everybody agrees that the best system is a wise and a noble king. But the worst system is a, evil or insane or deluded king. And so they deliberately chose a less efficient system so that there would be checks and balances. But I think you get to something very important, Gill, which is that in a parliamentary system, we're increasingly have a situation around the world where we have authoritarian, populist leaders who make appeals directly to the people, and they don't really go through the parliament. The danger there is then no electoral check on what they do, because if they can use their demagogic skills to get people to reelect them, they can dissolve constitutional restraint.
Yeah.
Now, the major difference between England and India and the United States is if the prime minister of India or the UK loses a majority in the House or has votes of no confidence, they have to have an election. And so it's very unlikely that that leader will be in opposition to the legislative branch. But in the United States, we regularly have divided government. And, when you have somebody like Biden, who, is a man of the legislature, he served most of his life in the Senate, but the House of Representatives is Republican, and he has a bare majority in the Senate. So I'm sure he would like to work with the Congress to get approval for what he does. But look at what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, Hamas. Biden is mostly responding on his own. Unilateralism. It's reactive unilateralism. He probably feels victimized by this. The president is much of a victim as a villain in this process. But the trend toward unilateralism continues.
Mr. Dev, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm there. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so I know that, we have this electoral college issue in the Senate. The system that was put together 250 years ago seems to have gone sort of lopsided, at least for the Senate, right? And so let me ask you sort of I don't know much about this. Do you think the US can ever sort of go into a parliamentary system?
No, I think it's very unlikely. But I think what the U.S. could do is go to a plebiscitary system. Um, there have been discussions about how to change the electoral college, which is clearly obsolete and outmoded, and very much disfavors the big cities because the state of New York is much larger proportionally than, but the same number of electoral college votes are given to tiny states that are very underpopulated. This now increasingly means that the principle of one person, one vote is violated. And there have been discussions about changing it so that you could force by legislation or constitutional amendment the electoral vote to match whatever is the majority of the people. But that would take a gigantic reform. And I think there's another thing was that, frankly, there was a reaction at the time of the Constitution of rejecting the parliamentary system. So I think the chance that we will go there with the president as a prime minister is close to zero.
Okay. So there's some alternatives. I mean, clearly one side doesn't like it because the way that it's structured today gives them excess power that is not really based on democracy, but based on some artificial configuration. And they don't want to change that for sure. But I was told in a previous podcast, Harold, correct me if I'm wrong, that you just need a simple congressional majority to think about maybe splitting New York into two or California into three. And if you do that, I mean, you get pretty close in terms of fixing the Senate.
That would never happen. I would bet my life on it. I think what makes more sense and is more achievable is, for example, the District of Columbia to become a state of the union, and for Puerto Rico to become a state of the union. These are predominantly democratic. There's no particular reason why we have only 50 states. The District of Columbia, these people have little or no representation, even though I've lived there for much of my life. And so I think there are changes that could be made, but we have to have more reasonable people in Congress to do it. Yeah. We're living in a time, as you know, Gill, of unprecedented polarization, and there's too much focus on electoral advantage than there is on this. Is one of the themes of my book. Everybody talks about America first. What they should be talking about is, are we thinking like Americans first? I take, for example, Keir Starmer's speech and Sunak's. Keir Starmer said, "Country first, party second," and that has to be a principle in the United States that's expected too.
So I want to go into, you mentioned this, transnational legal process and evolving theory and methodology. You say here the article situates transnational legal process, TLP, within the broader literature on international legal compliance and traces the theory's evolution over the years as legal scholars have critiqued, applied, and built upon the ideas. So what exactly is transnational legal process?
Yeah, so actually that article that you cite from the 2021 Brooklyn Journal of International Law is actually written by a young woman I never met, Regina Jeffries. But she's summarizing literature about my theory dating back to 1996. I first put it forward in 1993. And maybe the simplest way to put it is the general view is that international law has no enforcement mechanism, that domestic law is enforced by domestic courts and domestic prosecutors and domestic policemen. But the traditional criticism of international law is that it has no teeth. And my view is that's primarily because they're taking a horizontal view.
Hmm.
You know, if India violates international law, the U.S. has limited capacity on a horizontal basis to push it into compliance. Or if Russia invades Ukraine, there's limited capacity to do so. But in most law-abiding countries, the primary mode of enforcing international law is vertical, norm internalization, which means that international law is made part of domestic law, and it's obeyed as domestic law. And if you look at it this way, huge amounts of international law is being followed by this vertical process. Now, the question then becomes exactly how is this done? Through a process I call interaction, interpretation, and internalization. That actors interact and then they articulate norms, and then those norms are interpreted by authoritative bodies, and then they're internalized. And so you end up obeying them as a matter of domestic law. Maybe the best way to consider this is that when you and I were young, nobody wore a bicycle helmet, or nobody recycled plastic, or nobody wore a seatbelt. But what happened over time is that certain rules became promulgated and then habituated as norms, and then people start to obey them out of a sense of internal obedience. So, you know, when you go to a country, the reason why most people don't kill each other sitting in their classroom is because they share a common value set. And the question is whether the international law creates that value set. So the reason I developed this theory was by analogy to medical science. You know, most people, when they try to figure out how to cure somebody, they try to figure out what's wrong with the health of the system. My brothers are doctors, and my father said, you know, if you understand how the body works, then the reason why you can help make the body healthy. It turns out that what we see in the real world is a constant process of interaction to get interpretation of norms and to get them internalized or vertically downloaded into domestic legal systems. And this explains why nations do or do not obey.
Yeah, so there's still sort of an implementation question, right? So I don't know much about this, Harold. I'm sort of going to speculate. So we have 200 countries. They are in different levels of development, different characteristics of their legal and constitutional systems. And I believe that the Russian leader has an arrest warrant against him. And there's still 50 countries they he can travel to. And they're large countries. So that it's like half the world's population basically ignored the international court's arrest warrant. So is that a sustainable process? I mean, like you say, do they
Well,
really have
let me
any?
ask you a question, Gill. What's the last trip that Putin made?
I know that he has been to India, and I know that he has been to North Korea and China, perhaps.
He travels to countries where they won't respect an arrest warrant.
Yeah.
But already he's, even before the arrest warrants have been issued, they haven't issued them, they've requested them. His freedom of movement is already restricted. And so what's happening is he, while acting like these things don't matter, it's actually changed his internal conduct. You know, for example, do you now, when you drink a soda bottle, throw it on the ground? Or when you get on a bicycle, or when you get in a car, do you put on a seatbelt? Or do you go and smoke in public? I hope not. These are now against community norms. And so if you're going to violate those norms, you will be outcast. And now, is there perfect compliance? No. But, you know, I'm not sure where you're sitting. Where are you sitting? What city?
Yeah, I mean, we are
Oh
in a bit
no,
of
well, I'm
a.
asking her where do you sit now? Where are you? I see your I don't know where you are in the world.
Oh, I'm very close to you. I'm in Groton, Connecticut.
Groton, Connecticut, right? So do they steal cars in Groton? Yes. But does the law of does the law apply in Groton? Yes. So the fact that there may be incomplete compliance doesn't mean that the system of complex enforcement isn't working. And that's my whole point. You know, if you somebody steals something from you in Groton, Connecticut, you expect this to violate Connecticut law, for that person to be captured by Connecticut police, tried in the Connecticut court, and thrown in the Connecticut jail. That's a system of simple enforcement. But what we're looking at with Putin is first he has to be captured. That requires some kind of cooperation. Then he has to be tried. That requires another set of complex institutional interactions. And then they have to find him responsible, and then they have to enforce it against him. So what we're looking at is a system of complex enforcement with obviously less than perfect performance, but nevertheless, these norms do have impact. And that was my whole point, is that political scientists often just miss this. But when you're working in the system, as I did, and I worked for over 5 decades in 4 different presidential administrations, the law, you feel the law with regard to every single action. So it would be as if someone were waving a electronic wand over some fluids, and someone who doesn't know say, "See, nothing has changed." But if you actually look, and all of the negatives have changed to positives, there's a very dramatic change in its receptivity to the law, and that's the kind of shift that transnational legal process tries to bring about. And the last point is, I see transnational legal process as both diagnosis and prescription. You know, if you know where the system has broken down, you know where you can put pressure to try to make the change, you know. So if someone's artery is broken, the solution is to go in and repair the artery. If the problem is that a court has refused to rule that someone needs to do something, the answer is to go into that court and try to provoke an interaction that leads to an interpretation that leads to an internalization. Or if that doesn't work, go into the neighboring country's court and try to use that to create a norm that gets imported or translated into the system. So it's the same idea that you can use a diagnosis to create a prescription.
Yeah, so you have a recent article, Harold. So this is closer to what I can understand. Is our president a national security threat, you ask? And you say here, if we elected, could President Trump, by a single tweet, withdraw America from the United Nations, NATO, and every treaty and international organization to which the US belongs? Or if we elected, could President Biden gradually take us to war throughout the Mideast, Gaza, Yemen, Iran, and the Red Sea by supplying weapons and ordering drone strikes, cyber commands, and special forces without congressional approval? Yeah, so that so I'll show my bias here, Harold. The answer to the first question, I don't use caps too often, but the answer to the first question is in caps, YES, because he he has actually said that's what he's going to do. The second one is a little bit uncertain. It is situational in many ways, but I don't know exactly what's going to happen there. So where do you come out on this?
Well, my point is that this is the problem of executive unilateralism. I personally don't believe the Constitution allows the president to terminate every treaty. After all, look how much effort it took to get us into the United Nations or NATO. It should take a comparable amount of legislative input to get us out. And the court has, after the Supreme Court, after many years, has never articulated the constitutional rule. Just executive lawyers have taken a few snippets of case law and extrapolated a rule of unilateral termination. And part of what I say in my book is that's not possible at all. So for example, Congress has now passed a no NATO withdrawal act. This is so if Trump becomes president again and he tries to withdraw from NATO, you can bring this case to court. And the question is, would the Supreme Court, even this Supreme Court, rule that he can terminate every treaty at will? That would just return us to isolationism in one fell swoop. The point about Biden is that I don't think Biden, of course, doesn't want to create a World War III in the Middle East, but there's nothing to prevent him from being dragged into one because the system forces upon him so many choices that his primary reaction is unilateral. So this goes to my point. It's not about personalities, it's about structure. That's the point of those two questions, is that it can't be that the answer is throw the rascals out. In the case of Trump, the rascal's coming back. But it also can't be that the Democrats are good and the Republicans are bad. The president is often a victim as much as he is a villain in this piece, but there is a structural problem. And the sooner we understand it to be a structural problem and try to fix it with structural solutions, the better off we are.
So let me ask you this, Harold. I don't know much about this, obviously. So there's sort of a legal termination, and I'm thinking about United Nations and NATO specifically. And then there's sort of a psychological termination. And I think, sort of Trump tried this, actually. You say, if you don't pay and the Russians attack you, we're not going to come help you. It's not legal, but it's sort of a psychological thing, right? So is there a difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difference between having a contract and having a compact or community norm. Suppose you have 10 friends and every week you have a dinner, and then the agreement is everybody contributes 1/10. You have no signed agreement, and it could be that the richest person ends up paying most of the time. But in the case of a treaty, you actually have a contract, an agreement.
Yeah.
So the real question is Trump actually enforcing a legal rule, or is he in fact violating a legal rule? Even if nobody paid, we have a contract under Article 5 of the UN NATO Charter that if one of them is attacked, everyone is attacked. And is Trump really saying that in those circumstances he's not going to come to the defense? So he says a lot of things. He's an ignorant person, among many other qualities. I think he literally does not understand the pressure that would be brought to bear upon him to obey the law. I wrote a book called The Trump Administration and International Law that came out in 2018. And the main point was that Trump thought he was bigger than the international legal system, and he wasn't. For example, he wanted to take the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. We're back in. He wanted to take us out of the World Health Organization. We're still there. He wanted to take us out of these many trade agreements. We're still in all of them. So a lot of it was bluster and noise making.
But there's a practical question here, Harold. So I'm making all these things up. So suppose the Russians go into Poland, and let's say Trump is the president. I hope that's not the case. And there are timing issues, all sorts of decision timing issues here. I mean, he sat in the White House on Jan 6th for 6 hours watching TV and eating hamburgers, and he might just do that. Russians going into Poland because he loves that type of stuff. This was a practical question here, not just a legal question. And so that comes down to who's actually making the decision.
Well, I think there are a couple of important things, Gill. Number one, there are thousands and thousands of government officials. Every one of them, and I took this oath 7 times, takes an oath to uphold the laws of the Constitution laws of the United States of America. And that means that one of those laws is that we must defend. So Trump may not want to obey his oath, but I think what the last time proved is he's just one person. He's not bigger than the system. And, there are all kinds of things that he wanted to do that didn't happen because of the resistance. And the resistance was based on law.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little uncomfortable because, one of the things he's trying to do, ex-President Trump, is he calls it the swamp. He wants to essentially break the administrative system so that he can do whatever he wants. I don't know how easy it is, but that is really, he calls it Project 2025, if you have seen it. And that's objective, really. So if you break the administrative system, then we are really into royalties, right? Royalty and constitutional change and all of that. And so you don't think that could happen?
Well, first of all, you have to be competent. And you have to be intelligent, and you have to be single-minded. Here's my point: is the system is under threat, but probably the greatest threat is someone we haven't seen yet, not Trump.
Yeah.
Trump, for example, Trump doesn't like to invade foreign countries. In fact, that's against his credo. So you could imagine someone who becomes president who's very disciplined, very good at managing the bureaucracy, very good at coming. For example, Trump's cabinet, they all disobeyed him because he's lawless and they wanted to obey their own oath. Now he may not pick those people again, but I don't know that he'll be successful in picking a different group of people. But I think you're making an important point, which I think is very relevant to my academic work. Much academic work is in law ignores politics, ignores personalities, and ignores policy. And my view was I wanted to talk about how law actually works in the real world that I have seen as someone who worked in 4 presidential administrations over 5 decades. I thought it's extremely unusual I spent 10 years of my academic career in the government. That may not happen again anytime soon. So I thought there are these fictions that I read about in academic literature that just don't reflect reality. So I thought I owed it to myself and I owed it to others to put my lessons into this new book.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about, and we'll finish up with this, Harold. I know that you have to go, a little bit about the Russia-Ukraine war. And I'm reading from your keynote here, which is quite interesting. So you say here, I come to these remarks wearing 3 hats. First, I have taught international law for 4 decades, almost all of it at Yale. Second, during 5 different decades since 1980, I have served in legal and policymaking roles in the US government under 4 presidents in the courts, the Justice Department, and the State Department. And since 2016, I have been one of Ukraine's legal counsel in 3 different international cases before the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So, I mean, this is a very, very rich 3 axes to really see what is going on there, and we are in the midst of it. So I want to ask you first, so given everything that we know today, where do you think the war is? And if you were to speculate or predict, where do you think we are going?
Well, I think you make an important point about what I was hoping to do, Gill. There's a cancer researcher who tries to figure out how cancer grows and how you make the cells shrink. that person is doing very important research, but I wanted to be the person who applies the theory. And what we're doing for Ukraine against Russia is transnational legal process. Um, they are violating, Russia is violating international law quite flagrantly, as flagrantly as I've seen. So we've brought cases, forced interactions, and we're trying to get interpretations that they're violating international law. And then we're trying to use that to make it difficult. These are enforced by law-abiding countries. So they freeze Russia's assets. They don't let Putin travel there. They arrest him if they get near him. All of these restricts his freedom of movement. So we're creating a prison cell for him over time that will shrink over time. Now, in that article, we described early on the Ukrainians decided we are outmanned in terms of hard resources. They have bigger tanks, they have bigger guns, they have more soldiers, but we do have the law on our side. So how do we make the law a soft power asset? And we articulated a 5-part strategy. Number 1, information. Number 2, illegality. Number 3, isolation. Number 4, accountability. And number 5, diplomacy. That means Ukraine obeys the law and Russia doesn't. If that information gets out there, we are on the high road. And second, if we prove their illegality, then those countries that consider themselves law-abiding nations have trouble siding with them. I consider it to be a significant achievement of this process that China and India have not come in on the side of the Russians. They're not supplying them with lethal weapons, at least as far as we know. Third, we isolate Putin. We make him an outlaw in an interdependent world. That means he can't do business, he can't trade, everything he does is subject to sanctions. And it also means that people who deal with him, like his oligarchs, they have to get rid of their football teams, their yachts, etc. And his power is less. So on one side is an alliance, and on the other side is an isolated individual. And then we create mechanisms whereby people who violate international law are held accountable, as many different courts as you can. And then finally, what this does is it helps to balance the power. So if and when there's negotiation, which I hope is coming soon, the Ukrainians have resources and allies on their side of the table. It's amazing. You would have said Putin believed he could invade Ukraine and defeat them in a week. And it turned out he was wrong. Now, it's obviously a lot is because of the heroism of the Ukrainian soldiers. But another piece of it is transnational legal process. So it proves that using the law proactively can allow you to combat legal violators. So in one setting, I'm talking about using the law proactively to check Trump. In another international environment, I'm talking about using transnational legal process to check Putin.
Yeah, so I want to finish up, Harold, by coming back to the US, and I want to ask you sort of a loaded question. A lot of talk about the second civil war, one way or the other. Do you think our democracy and the judicial system that we have currently in place, actually some of the Supreme Court judges are your students, we are currently in place, is robust enough for us to survive whatever outcomes we're going to get in less than 4 months?
I certainly hope so. Trump did a lot of damage in 4 years and frankly exposed that the system was much more fragile than we believed. But I do think there's an undercurrent of belief in the rule of law that matters to a vast majority of Americans. Why do I believe this? Because most Americans came here to flee from lawless countries where you had autocrats making up arbitrary rules, and they wanted to be somewhere where they had greater freedom, and freedom that was ensured and guaranteed. But here, just take an example. The the CEOs of the 100 top American companies were interviewed, none of them wants Trump. Why? Because they need a rule of law system to have settled expectations, invest, and everything else. So I have faith in America that its strength is deeper. And for that matter, I believe that in India or the UK, there's a very strong bedrock faith in democracy and constitution as the basis of the rule of law. And none of these countries want to go back to king. And think of Gandhi, or think of Winston Churchill. These nations went through existential change by relying on the rule of law. And I think it's a rejection of who they are. It's a rejection of national identity to go in a different direction. Now, I'm an optimist. If I wasn't an optimist, I wouldn't write this kind of thing.
Yeah, I follow you, Hal. I've been getting nightmares when I go to sleep every night. So you have to stay optimistic. Otherwise, it's a hard life. So excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me, Hal. Really enjoyed it.
All right, thank you for reading my work, and thank you for talking to me about it. And let's hope the rule of law survive.
Thank you.
Okay, take care now.